Continuing our focus on the suspension of the CBN Governor, Sanusi Lamido. We're joined now, as you might have seen in that welcoming slide, by Tilawa Oyefeso, who is a financial lawyer. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, already you have those who are saying that this is, they talk about the legality of this suspension. So some think it's illegal, it's usurping his position. But tell us, give us a perspective legally. Where does the president derive the powers to suspend him?
Thank you very much, Chamberlain. Well, we'll be careful the way we approach this issue, because from the statement we read yesterday, it was referred to as a suspension. Yeah. And legally speaking, we would find that there's a difference between a suspension and a removal, as it were, because by virtue of the provisions of the law, when you talk about a suspension, you're actually dealing with an abeyance of certain rights that an individual possesses. It doesn't necessarily deal with a diminution of rank or demotion. So essentially, that he was suspended doesn't mean he was removed. But my grouse here is with the provisions of the CBN Act, particularly Section 8. It deals with the appointment of the CBN Governor, and if you go through the provisions of Sections 9, 10, and 11, it deals also with the removal. So the appointment of a CBN Governor is actually done by the President, subject to confirmation by the Senate. The removal of the CBN Governor can be done by the President, but subject to a support of 2/3 majority of the Senate. So when the President suspends the CBN Governor, the question now arises, does he have the power to do that? To my own mind, he could have the power to suspend the CBN Governor, because the suspension is different, from a removal. But, we have to focus on the interpretation of the court, because as it stands, Mr. Sanusi has decided to proceed to court, to seek redress. So the court will give us an opportunity, to, let us know whether or not the removal or the suspension, as it were, was validly done in the law.
Because some also say that, well, in that law, it only makes provision for removal and not suspension. So maybe you say, as you say, he should go if he goes to court, the court will now determine all of those. But do we call this a suspension? Because if you look at, yes, he was announced to have been suspended. Then you have Dr. Sarah Lade, who was announced to act in his capacity while he's away. And then you have a name or names forwarded to the Senate for confirmation as substantive governor. Some just say that this is just removal.
That's a very perfect point to note, because as it stands, to my own mind, it also seems to be a removal. So that's why I fear that Mr. Sanusi, might win in the court of law, because the provisions of the CBN Act is very clear as to the procedure for a removal, which was not followed by the president, in doing what, the president did. Because I would like to also want you to avert your mind to a provision of the law, particularly on suspension. There's an authority, I call it Lewis and Heifer and Sons by Lord Denning, where he actually spelled out, the rights of, the government in performing administrative functions to carry out a suspension. And when the government carries out a suspension like that, the rights of that individual will necessarily cease for a moment. So essentially, Mr. Sanusi is still the CBN Governor, but he now has a different title, the suspended, CBN Governor. But if he goes to court now to challenge, the provisions of the Act and to get an interpretation of what has been done, then I fear that, the court might rule in his favor.
Will this also pop up in court, and how might the court view it if they look at the corresponding actions of the government? If the government say, listen, according to our letter, the notes we communicated to him is that he is suspended. And of course, you have to have someone who will act in his capacity while he's suspended. But what if the court then says, or someone presents to the court, maybe in his prayers, the suspended CBN governor says, well, going by the corresponding actions of government, the intention of that is removal. And so, if he argues that way, he will have a point, will he?
Yes, he would. But, definitely we cannot conjecture at this point, because the questions will definitely come before the court. And when that happens, the court will have the opportunity to decide, because it all depends on the prayers that you have before the court. The court will not give a party what it doesn't ask for.
Okay.
Let's look at the CBN Act. Do you think it gave too much power to the central bank governor?
That's a very fundamental question, because I've always argued that the CBN Act gives so much powers, to the central bank governor. And the result of this is that a central bank governor can be carried away, by the provisions of the CBN Act in behaving in a certain type of way that may not be acceptable to the generality of the public. But, we have to look at the framework establishing the CBN Act so that we can get a proper perspective, because in other jurisdictions of the world, you find that hardly do you see, the president or the National Assembly or the legislature, as it were, interfering with the functions of the central bank, because banking is essentially sui generis, let me use that phrase, because it's in a class of its own, and the independence and autonomy of the central bank governor is explicitly recognized all over the world. And the position of the central bank governor, as it were, is such that it can print money, it can issue currencies, and it can determine the monetary policy of a particular economy. The National Assembly doesn't have such powers. The government doesn't have such powers. If you find in the position of the law, particularly if you look at Section 4 of the Constitution, it deals with legislative powers. And the legislative powers in the exclusive legislative list has to do with borrowing, coinage, determining weights and measures. But the powers of the CBN governor goes beyond that. He has the power to issue currency notes. And you find out that even in today's economy, what we have as legal tender, they are paper currency notes. So a CBN governor that has the power to print money, a CBN governor that has the power, to even issue bonds, has all the powers, in my own opinion. And for someone to be in custody of such powers, it will only mean that it may fall into certain types of temptation, which of course we've seen over the years. A lot of experts had argued that, look, it should be checked, it should be curbed, because bankers have a certain kind of conduct. They don't behave recklessly in public. There's a way they comport themselves because they know the implications of the banking laws.
Don't you have a check for him?
Well, the position of the law as I speak today is that there are really no checks. Because if
not even the board?
Not even the board. I'm telling you the truth. Because if you observe that the statement read by the presidential spokesman on media and publicity was that there were allegations of financial recklessness by the Financial Reporting Council. But we don't have the details of these. We cannot really, speculate.
Okay, you talked about the board. In 2007 or thereabout, there was a proposal in the National Assembly to have the act amended to remove him as the chairman of the central bank board and to remove the deputy governors. Would that have helped if that amendment had gone through?
Well, to my own mind, the issues that the amendment of the CBN Act focuses on are not so critical, particularly as it has to do with minimizing the powers of the CBN governor. That's my personal opinion, because you would find that in other parts of the world, the president of a country, I'll cite an instance, particularly in the United States, sometimes in 1835, the president of the country was actually censured for interfering with banking. I'm referring to Andrew Jackson. And at the time he did that, that was when the National Banking Act that eventually led to the promulgation of the Federal Reserve Act was established. And the purpose of establishing the Federal Reserve Act was to let the world know of the autonomy, of central banking, and such that the government should not in any way interfere, with the functions of the central bank. The idea is, let us not look at the personality involved in the office. It is not about the person, it's about the office. A lot of people now are attacking the gentleman, Mr. Sanusi, oh, he did this, he did that. But I am looking at it beyond that, because it goes to the office of the CBN. Because assuming without conceding that those allegations were true, and something happens to the CBN governor today, maybe he dies, it doesn't mean that those allegations too will die, because it can actually be commenced against that office because of the provisions of the Interpretation Act. So
So the office could be held liable
Yes.
even in the absence
Yes,
of the person.
yes, that's the provision of the law, because it's actually a public office. It is not as if it is the holder of the office, that owns the office. The office is a sacred office. It's a public office, and any civil or criminal action that is commenced against any person in that office outlives the person.
Did the office come across as being too strong?
Yes, it is. It is a very, very strong, hallowed, critical, and sensitive position.
Rightly or wrongly?
Well, to my own mind, I would say wrongly, and this I say because you find that there has been a knee-jerk reaction surrounding his suspension. Within 24 hours from now, you find that foreign exchange has been halted, foreign exchange on the foreign exchange market has been halted. Investors, are panicking because, they realize that a country where the president can tamper with the office, of the CBN governor, just like that, will only mean that investors' confidence, will be eroded in that type of a country. And it will only mean that the international organizations will beam its searchlight, on the activities of the country. It will only mean that the members of the National Assembly will begin to have a rethink in terms of the powers, of the president.